Friends, when I read through the scriptures, I told my wife, I said, look, I'm going to be honest. I'm going to read both sides. I have books in my bag on all sides of this issue right now, reading on the airport in here this afternoon. I told my wife, I said, I teach at Biola University, and if I changed my views on this subject, I would lose my job. But it's more important we get this subject right than I have a job. We have to get this right as a church. And as I read through the scriptures, I noticed a few things. Number one, there's not a single passage in the Old Testament or New Testament that supports homosexual behavior. Not one. Second, until the middle of the 20th century, not a single church leader, Christian or Jew, affirmed homosexual behavior as being right. Third, every regulation in the Bible just assumes male-female sex. That's just the assumption. Fourth, every proverb in the Bible assumes heterosexuality. Fifth, even the 10 Commandments assume heterosexuality. Honor your father and mother. Do not commit adultery. And then 10th, do not covet your neighbor's wife. Well, let's look just quickly at 3 passages that I think lay out a biblical perspective on this issue. And number 1 is right in the garden in Genesis chapter 2. God has designed sexual expression for all people. It says, therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Right at the beginning of the scriptures, we see God's design, we see God's intent, that a man and a woman leave their parents, who are a mom and a dad, they cleave to each other, and they become one. Now, some critics look in this and they say, well, this chapter is just describing how it happened, but it doesn't apply to how we're supposed to live today. Well, the interesting thing is Jesus commented on this passage. Jesus was asked about the marriage issue, in particular in relation to divorce. And in Matthew 19, he said, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And said, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let not man separate. But then you fast forward into the book of Leviticus and you see another passage on this. Leviticus 18:22 says, you shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. Now notice it doesn't say the one who does this. Gays are an abomination. It doesn't say that. It says the act itself is an abomination. Now Justin Lee, in his book Torn, he says, so scholars on both sides of the argument agreed that this probably had something to do with cult prostitution. That made sense to me. In other words, he's saying this passage doesn't really have to do just with homosexual behavior per se, but in that culture, homosexual behavior was experienced through cult prostitution, so he was condemning the form of it today, not the way it's practiced in our culture in the present. Well, let me ask you a question. This same passage in Leviticus also condemns adultery, child sacrifice. Are those okay if we remove them from cult prostitution? No, those are still wrong regardless of whether it's cult prostitution or not, right? In fact, Robert Gagnon, who studied this, he's probably the foremost conservative expert. He said when the biblical writers rejected homosexual cult prostitution, they were in effect rejecting the whole phenomena of homosexual practice. They were repudiating a form of homosexual intercourse that was the most palatable in their cultural context. And I think he's right. You see, when the biblical authors wanted to condemn cult prostitution, they did it clearly. In Deuteronomy 23:17, it says, none of the daughters of Israel shall be a cult prostitute, and none of the sons of Israel shall be a cult prostitute. Friends, Leviticus has a very powerful passage about this. But third, let's go to the New Testament. What about the book of Romans, where Paul talks about this? In Romans 1, a very powerful passage. Paul says, for this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another. men committing shameless acts with men and receiving themselves the due penalty for their error. Now, this describes homosexual behavior as not natural. And powerful words like shameless, those are strong words that Paul used. Now, the key to understanding this verse is looking at the larger context of what Paul is doing in Romans 1. See, if you look at the three verses right before in Romans 1:18, Paul says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made, so they are without excuse." What's Paul saying? Paul is condemning the whole human race. He's saying because God has made himself evident in nature. We know God is powerful. We know God is good. We know God is self-existent. And then he points to the design between male and female and says, similarly, we know there's a biological design, but people reject it. Now, one common objection to this is people will say, well, Paul was speaking of pederasty. Now, pederasty is a very disturbing practice that was common in the Roman culture at this time. Basically, a man would take a young boy, 12, 13, 14 years old, and, quote, mentor him, which meant he would show him certain things in life to be successful, but he would also use him to have anal sex. These boys, 12, 13, 14 years old, they were used that way by the men, and it was common, accepted practice in that culture. So I just read a pastor who wrote a letter to his congregation last week, and he said that Paul was not talking about homosexual relations as we have them today. He was talking about pederasty or cult prostitution. But the problem is when you read the passage, what does it say? It says men committing shameless acts with men. This is not about pederasty, friends. And besides, there was no lesbian equivalent of pederasty in ancient Rome. Friends, as I read the scriptures and I look back as church fathers have dealt with the scriptures, this issue is clear. I've also found this. If we want to find a way around what the Bible teaches, there's always a way to do it. In fact, some of the attention paid to re-envisioning some of these passages reminds me of Genesis chapter 3. Did God really say? So what do we do about this? In a minute, I asked if we could take questions live, and you're going to bring up some microphones. You're going to have a chance to ask questions of clarification, challenges, however I can help you through this issue.